Hello, hello everyone. Welcome to Curated Reality. Adnan, say hi.
Hey, hi everybody.
Okay, we also have Pratik with us today. Hi, Pratik. Welcome to the stream.
Hey everyone.
Okay, Adnan, what are we talking about today?
Today, I think, uh, I don't know. I had hoped that this topic would not be needed 2 years after release of a particular library, but here we are at 2 years with half the code base still being experimental. So I think it is interesting that we are trying to talk about how you can migrate your app to Compose. The hope is by the time you do this, Compose would have become like full-fledged, 100% non-experimental. At least that's the hope. But yeah, that's what we are trying to get into today. That hey, if you have an existing app, how do you migrate to Compose? What strategy do you follow? How do you go about it? Do you need to rewrite the entire app? What does that effort look like? Yeah, I think that should cover most of it.
Yeah, okay, got it. And I have heard that Buffer is migrating to Compose, right, Pratik?
Yes,
So,
actively.
yeah, can you, share something with us, like why did you choose to migrate and what are the things you considered before migrating? And yeah, let's start with that.
Good question. So, Buffer, let me quickly open up the repo because I'm not fresh on the numbers. So, our our main Android app is 79% Kotlin and 20% Java.
Mhm.
But even with this high ratio of Kotlin over Java, most of our screens right now, it's sort of in a hybrid architecture where some of the modules are written in MVVM, some of them are still in MVP, but using Kotlin. So the problem that we started noticing in certain key flows for the users was so one of the biggest screens for us, or rather the highest traffic inducing screen for us, is the composer, where we actually compose your social media post, right? So considering the fact that it's like almost 7 years old at this point, and it has gone through several attempts of rewrite or introducing new architectures, it's in a place where part of it, handles state with MVP,
Mhm.
part of it has its state owners with views, part of it is also with MVVM. So due to this nature of the state itself being scattered in multiple places, we started noticing issues where you one of the UI components would be updated because of a change in what you were doing within the composer, but the resultant data in the back that would essentially create your post would not be updated. So
Mhm.
essentially, we had to like sync across multiple layers. And this had started to introduce a lot of complicated bugs for us, which were really difficult to reproduce. Forget about fixing it. So that's pretty much when Compose became stable, and we decided like. And so one of the biggest selling point for us for Compose was the data flow pattern that it
Mhm.
promotes, which is like pretty
You-
top down. Your events flow up, and components just consume data. So for essentially, even before Compose was stable, we had made attempts towards um, taking our state ownership into that model of unidirectional data flow. So it almost felt like a natural progression that this is what we've been trying to attempt, and Compose as a framework essentially allows us to go full blown into it. And we tried going small first and trying it out with a couple of new screens and smaller components, and we saw really promising results there. So it felt like the right time now to migrate the composer and essentially piece by piece entire app over to Compose.
Got it. Okay, so before migrating, did you hit any roadblock? For example, what we have been noticing in our organization is our AGP version is really low. I think it's 4 point something when we made attempt to introduce Compose. And that is not because of our code base, that is because of a third party library we use. So, did you face any kind of issues in that area?
Luckily not, because most of the third-party dependencies that we have, they are pretty like traditional.
Hmm.
Your Jetpack libraries, some standard Square libraries and Dagger and stuff. So if we talk about like third party libraries, like which are very niche in what they offer, we don't
Right.
really have much. I think we have just one or two. One would be the floating action speed dial thing that
Hmm.
like expands it into a couple of options. But aside from that, we don't have any third-party library that is not widely adopted. And that again gives us the benefit that most of the popular libraries, when Compose was announced,
Right.
they started work on their in ensuring that they are compatible with us. So and that was not an issue. And also we at least our dependencies, we are usually very particular about staying at least one version behind the latest stable version. So that has not been an issue because we were anyways like as libraries get updated, we also essentially start bumping up our versions to eh, prepare ourselves essentially for any future change that may come up. Yeah,
Got it.
but that also like bites us in the back because take for example with Kotlin 1.7, synthetic extensions will go away,
Right. Right.
right?
Right. Right. Yes.
It was already deprecated, but we are at a point. I think we are using 1. I'll have to check. Let me see. I'll tell you the number. But what that essentially means is we have to now accelerate our migration away from synthetics. Like in our 20 plus modules, we don't have synthetics, but there are a few core modules that we've not really had the chance to refactor yet. So that also means that while other companies might have time to figure out a strategy for them to migrate stuff, we'll have to do it at a much faster pace. So it has like its pros and cons, but
Right.
yeah, we stay pretty up to date with what's out there.
Got it.
So we're using 1.7.1 right
Okay.
now for
Yeah.
Kotlin. Yeah.
There's a question in the chat from Sasikant. He's
Mm-hmm.
asking, what about performance? Did you notice any performance difference after introducing Compose, or even between different Compose versions?
Good question. We do notice performance issues in our debug builds, especially on screens that are feeds. Luckily, our app does not have. Okay, let me rephrase it. Luckily, so far, the screens that we have introduced Compose to, or the screens that we've built from scratch using Compose, they don't have that extensive size of a feed in the sense that there's no infinite scroll as such. So
Mm.
one of the features that we are going to launch in the coming weeks, it's called ideas. It's almost like Pocket but for buffer. But that is built completely in Compose. Like the entire composer, the entire UI, all of the components are in Compose. And in the debug builds of those apps, even with Compose 1.3 stable, we do notice like performance lags. But luckily that's only the issue with debug builds. On production, we've not seen any issues so far. So yeah, fingers crossed. Not yet, but let's see if we do run into that.
Got it.
What has been like your strategy? How did you think about it, right? Like, do you do it at a screen level, given that you have multiple architectures as place as well, right? So I'm assuming the way they are hooked up with the views might be very different in MVVM versus MVP, given that that contrast exists, right? And at the crux
Yeah.
of it, yes, right, it is XML versus this, right? But then how do you, I'm not sure if the code base has things like data binding and things like those, which can, I'm assuming, make
Mm-hmm.
it slightly more challenging if you use data binding as well, right? Because XML and the code is now tied. What does that look like? What has been your strategy? How do you think about that?
That's a very good question. Thanks for asking. So let me actually pull up. I have a diagram from a thread that I had written, like in the internal company blog a while back. I think that'll give you an idea of what the screen looks like and how we are looking at from a strategy perspective. Give me a second. I'll just pull that diagram up.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So I think I should download this. Hold on. Okay. Cool. I'll try sharing my screen.
Yeah.
And I also think it will not be visible, so maybe I'll have to like hold on. Share screen. window. Okay, tell me, what do you see right now? Because I can't tell what's being shared.
I think right now you have shared the Skype thingy.
Oh, okay. Hold on. Stop sharing. Switch screen or window. Desktop. Now what do you see?
Yeah, now
Yeah,
we can
see a
Okay,
diagram.
see
perfect.
the diagram.
Cool. So this is the Android Composer. Now, as you can see, like from a component perspective, it is built up of like a lot of things. But if I were to like describe it behind the scenes how it works, it's essentially this complicated mess. So we have a composer activity, then we have within that we have a content fragment, and then we have a composer view model that sits on the activity level. Then we have a composer presenter. Okay,
Pratik, just give me a moment. I
hold on.
think it's
Yeah,
way too big.
can you?
Yes, now you can explain.
Yes. So as you can see, like, so should I start from the beginning or like
Yeah,
did
you
you
can
catch
start.
the
No, no,
last
you
10
can
seconds?
start from the beginning.
Cool. So if I show you first let me show where's the diagram again, right? So this is the Android Composer.
Hmm.
Um, it's got a lot of components, but like behind the scenes, if we were to like break down what the architecture or setup looks like, you can see. Okay, someone's trying to mess up the call. Yeah. So you can see like you've got a composer activity. It's got its own view model. We also have from the 4 or 5 years ago a legacy composer presenter that's also sit at the activity level. We then have a content fragment which is embedded within the activity, which is essentially this area where the input text field and the media view is. That also has its own MVP, setup,
Mhm.
and then it also has its own view model setup, right? So essentially, like over the years, so many different attempts at like migrating it to like modern standards were only done sort of like part way. So it never fully migrated over to any one particular architecture. So that introduces like a lot of very interesting challenges. So one, the activity itself is in Kotlin. The
Mhm.
view models are in Kotlin, but then the presenter is in Java. The content fragment itself also is in Java. Now, if we look at the different components here, like the campaigns view, the channel selector, the input text, and all of this, this like from a decoupling standpoint, this is very easy to actually just build out separate compose components and then try and embed them into your screen, right, piece by piece. But the problem that we'll run into here would be, since all of this is hosted within the fragment and the fragment is in Java, we can essentially not like get around to doing that, right? So we've had to take a slightly different approach in terms of how we perform this migration. So first of all, since we are like a team of two, we don't have like 4 or 5 engineers working on the Android team. We cannot like justify like taking dedicated time just for the refactor of this entire composer screen into compose. We'll have to essentially go part by part, small steps at a time. So that's one strategy, which is like decoupling the entire screen into small individual components and working on them one by one. But what that also means is we'll have to figure out a strategy to bring those new components piece by piece once we are done with them, because we don't want to run into a place where we essentially in the background migrate everything and then like slot in everything at once and then push out one big release, right? Because there's high chance that things might break if that is the case. So we want to make changes, we want to also ship those changes as soon as we can. So there were two options for us in that point. How do we want to slot in these new changes, because the fragment itself is in Java? The straightforward one would be just convert the fragment from Java to Kotlin. But then our fragment itself is like pretty large. It's got a lot of lines of code. So what we essentially have decided to do is we have to build like sort of like a wrapper view that will do one job, which is just host a composable, right? So that way, that view itself we can host into our fragment for the time
Mhm.
being, and then inflate the composable using the Android view. Since that view will be in Kotlin, it'll just host that one composable. So what that essentially means is we have introduced like one more extra layer of compatibility,
Mm-hmm.
but that also means that we don't have to immediately convert the fragment to Java, because that's like it fragment to Kotlin, because
Right.
it's got like a lot of business logic in it, right? So we want to go, the intention behind this whole refactor is we want to go piece by piece. We also want to do it incrementally, and we also want to deliver value to our users at an incremental pace. So that essentially means like we'll have to ship these changes as soon as we are done with them. And so like this felt like the right strategy without undertaking anything big in the first step itself. If that makes sense.
Got it. Got it. So if people want to go through this article, can you just share the link with us?
This is not like a public article.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this is like an internal thing right now. But I will probably push something out to the buffer engineering blog
Mm-hmm.
once we've like accomplished like a significant percentage of the migration, because right now this is also a lot of trial and error for us.
Right, right, right. Okay, so
Give me
there's
just 1 minute. Okay, my cat wants to go out. I'll just be
yeah,
back in like
sure,
5
sure.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, there's one more question from Sasikant in the chat. He's asking,
Mhm.
do you use baseline profiles or something as well, or just use profiles shipped with the library?
In terms of profiling and benchmarking, we don't have anything yet.
Mhm.
But since we've noticed there are issues in at least the debug builds with performance, it makes sense for us to actually add that to ensure that if users use our apps on like lower end devices, they don't face any issue. So we've not done that yet. It's on the cards.
Okay. Okay, cool.
Mm-hmm.
While migrating, did you face any kind of how do I phrase it? Uh, um, Let me rephrase the question. So, what are the challenges you are facing while migrating to Compose?
Yeah, I think the biggest problem that we are facing is like Compose is sort of very soft opinionated about how state ownership should look like, right? And
Mhm.
that's like for good reason. Your state should like come from one place, and essentially your components should consume that state, right? Uh, Now the problem that we are running into is before pre-compose, when we used to build screens,
Mhm.
we used to consider the state for that screen as like one object, consider like, for example, right? But now if your screen itself is a composition of multiple components, you
Mhm.
also have to think about breaking down that state into smaller pieces, right? So like take for example the diagram again, or rather the screenshot that I showed you.
Right.
Inherently the case with that screen is it has like one object called composer state, right? And
Mhm.
there are other smaller live data pieces that we handle, like that take care of events for us. But if you look at like the bigger picture, we have one big state object that contains all of the media, all of the text changes, what social media profiles this will go to, if it is a part of any campaign or not, is this like a new post or is this being edited? So essentially it's like a data class with multiple properties, right? And that's worked fine, because at like before compose was introduced, that entire object was just being consumed by the entire like the fragment itself, and the fragment used to like toggle things on off or like change the styling treatment based on what the properties were. Now that we've started decoupling things into smaller components, what it also means is like we'll have to consciously invest into making sure that the state objects are also smaller. Now, you can make an argument that there is no need for doing that. Like you can just pass that one big object down to every component, right? But take for example, like if you were just building that top bar for showing which social media channels you have selected, that only requires a list of social media profiles, right?
Right.
It does not have anything to do with what media you have selected for the post, what text there is this a part of the campaign, right? So it's getting like a lot of unnecessary baggage with it, right? That makes it difficult for testing because then you'll have to like stub a lot of different things, like unnecessarily create like large objects just to get the test to set up to work. So one of the challenges, I think it's not a challenge because it's a long-term investment. We'll go a long way in ensuring like things become better. Is essentially also thinking about how our state is architected and how we can simplify it for on a screen level and then also for a component level. So that's one thing.
Good.
And then like the other piece within this state situation is that not every screen is like an MVVM screen, right? So there's also certain like take for example the composer itself. Part of its screen, like a good part of its screen state comes from like an MVVM based view model, right? But then there are certain pieces that still reside within like custom views or presenters, right? So how do we incorporate those sync or those state changes, or how do we like essentially incrementally also move away from those presenters, into smaller view models while ensuring that nothing breaks within that screen? So that has been like a challenge, and it's like an ongoing challenge because this is like very much in progress right now.
Mhm. So have you created any custom components in Compose? And if you have created, then what is the difference between creating a custom component using the traditional method and the Compose?
Yeah, we have. We have created like a few of them, and with the new feature that we're launching in a couple of weeks, we've actually created a few complex ones as well. Like the straightforward answer is like it's very simple and easy to think about when you're like writing those custom components because it's essentially sort of like a high level blueprint of what that component looks like, and then you describe that using the smaller composables, like the primitive composables, right?
Mhm.
With custom views it's not that straightforward because with custom views, if like let's say you had to, I don't know, build like a media component, and the media component has like a few different variants. If it's a video, we have to show like a play icon there,
Right.
right? If it's a GIF, you have to show the GIF label. If it's a video or a GIF, you'll have to like preload a thumbnail to show as part of that media view. If it's just an image, there's an aspect ratio associated with it. There's some border styling treatment. So like for these variations, it's really easy for us to think about in Compose. Like it's pretty much like an if-else statement, like a block of if-else statements for
Mhm.
adding those style treatments. But when you translate that essentially into how would you build that with XML, it's not as straightforward. Like you'll have to think about it in terms of like layout params and measure passes and different dynamic style attributes that you inherit
Mhm.
through XML. So it's not, I won't say in terms of complexity is different, but like, just from like, being productive with the framework. Like if you were given a design, how easy it is for you to actually go ahead and build that component out. It's much more straightforward with Compose. And it's like in the first go, you can get like, 80% of the way and without any major errors. With XML, that's not the case. Like you might envision something in your head and think like, okay, this is the thought process I'll use to build this screen out or this
Mhm.
component out, and you'll go and write it, and you'll have to test it on your screen to see if that is correct or not. More often than not, you might notice some, alignment issues or styling issues. That has been like very less with Compose because essentially what you think about, you're very easily able to translate that in code.
Yeah. Adnan, do you have any question?
Yeah, like this is a slight off track to the
Yeah, yeah,
topic, but then one of the things that you touched about was trying to achieve that unidirectional data flow, right?
yeah.
And let's not get into why you should do that, assuming that we all are aware of the benefits. Uh, and now that you're migrating to Compose, do you see yourself considering MVI as an architecture, given that MVI, by the nature of it, was built to support that unidirectional data flow and aid that much more easier, right? Are there considerations? Have you given that a thought? How do you think about those things?
We haven't, and this is like we've not even discussed MVI, and I think part of the reason why we've not discussed MVI is um, there have been like hard lessons learned from adopting clean architecture within our code base, right? So with clean architecture is like there are very distinct layers that you have to build and then agree to long term, right? To essentially say that you're architecting your code base based on this particular pattern. And what we've noticed is there are certain things within clean architecture that's just like for the sake of architecture. It doesn't essentially add a lot of value. One of the one of the key things that we've run into is so with clean architectures, there are models in distinct models for the same thing in multiple layers: your data layer, your remote layer, your UI layer, your cache layer. And then essentially what happens is um, as the control flows between these three different layers, your data type is essentially being massaged and transformed into all of these layer specific model types, right? Um, and like from an architecture standpoint, it makes sense why you would want to do that. But then if you think about it purely from a productivity standpoint, that you're a team of two and you have to deliver value, at like a reasonable pace, that means that even for a small change in, let's say, an API, for like even one field, you have to make changes in six different layers, six different models, six different model mappers, all of the tests. So what you notice is like, while clean architecture is giving us a lot of benefit, it's also slowing us down quite a lot because I've noticed this at least for myself. It takes me like half a day just to change models, right? And for the web team or for our iOS team, that's not the case. And anytime that there is like a significant model change, like especially with like room migrations when it was not supporting auto migrations, writing tests for that, writing all the tests for the different layers, ensuring that um, all of our test factories generate the right model for our test, right? That's like a lot of work. And with MVI, essentially UDF, if you think about it, like unidirectional data flow, MVI is like a much more like involved, like take it up to 11 sort of version of that. And what we think is like, yes, there is value for MVI. I'm not saying there isn't. For our use case and for our team setup, it might be like too much, right? Because there's like reducers, and then you'll have to essentially take care of events in a very specific way. I see value in that, but like for a small team of two, it might not compared to just adopting unidirectional data flow as is,
Mhm.
and then comparing it to the MVI setup. Both of us give essentially the same value, but MVI will be a lot of work for us to adopt. So maybe that's the reason why we've not like even considered it. So even with like clean architecture right now, we tried simplifying things quite a lot. Like couple of layers, we've essentially tried to merge them together because it makes sense for them to be like cohesive instead of like just being decoupled, because clean architecture says that you have to decouple it. So yeah, that's been like a learning.
Right. And I think it is also a function of, as you rightly said, right, the team size and the environment that you are in, right? Like the benefits exist for sure, yeah. But then, as you rightly said, right, it's not like you have the luxury of rewriting the entire app from scratch today so that you can choose to go with MVI, which would make it much easier, right? Like, hey, everything is from scratch, you don't have to worry about it. But then migrating everything and making sure everything works, and at it's not going, as you said, right? It's not going to be like one huge release that we just migrate from X to Y, right? It has to be
Yeah.
incremental, and until that, it becomes very hard, especially with a small two-member team, to manage all of this and take care that you don't mess up things, right? And
Yeah.
that point of yours, specifically about clean architecture, right? I think that is like a common struggle a lot of people go through in their wherein like we have had discussion. I have personally been involved in discussions, say, do we need a mapper, do we need separate model classes? And I think as you rightly said, it depends, right? It depends. Like there might be, if your use cases are so much that your backend keeps changing quite a few things, it might make sense to have a different data model for you so that you can restrict it at that level layer and not have the UI layer being affected. But at the same time, as you said, it also comes with that cost of it, right? Like spending close to 3 4 hours per day just to change like a couple of models and update the tests. definitely feels slow down, especially with a team size which is not humongous that hey, you can cover up with more people. I think that definitely makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing, right? Today it has been like hey, clean architecture says so, that's why we do it, kind of a mentality for a lot of people. And I think that's where people need to stop, take a step back, see
Yeah.
what works for them, adapt it. Nobody is going to punish you for like merging two layers or not having like separate models, right? It's uh, not like somebody is going to be impressed by having those, right? It's more about what works for you, what confidence do you get
Yeah.
out of it.
Yeah, and it also boils down to like, if by adopting a pattern or a framework, we actually notice any considerable improvement in our workflow itself, right?
Exactly.
If by adopting MBI, if we don't see like, our output has changed or like there's, considerable advantage in testability or anything like that, then it's essentially like we have like 20 different modules in our project, and all of these modules are like, silos of their own different technologies, right? One has MPI, one is MPVM, the other might be written like, in like, server driven UI and whatnot. We have the liberty to play around with different things, but at the end of the day, users won't care if your app is written in Jetpack Compose, or it has clean architecture, or it's just like, everything dumped into an activity, right? At the end of the day, it has to work for them, and it has to have like new features, like, week over week. So what matters to us most is how can we release value at like a consistent speed, with quality, and also ensuring that all of the existing room for errors have been covered up. And like Compose goes a long way in like essentially covering our bases in most of these cases, right? It's trivial bugs are like really really hard to introduce. Like you'll have to be completely sleep deprived or writing code while you're sleeping to be able to introduce those kind of trivial bugs. But with XML, it's like so verbose and so monotonous that it like by reason it just becomes that way, that you end up introducing those kind of bugs. So that's been like an advantage. And like even in terms of UI testing, right? That's been like a huge win for us. Our testability, as we are adopting Compose on different screens, our testability is actually skyrocketing, because earlier we were just testing business logic, but now we are also able to essentially test out all of the variants of the components in isolation, right? And that was not like, it was possible, but it was not as straightforward or as easy to work with than it is with Compose.
Yeah, so I
That's
was about to ask the question about what kind of testing you are using with Compose. So, are you talking
Yeah.
about the testing of the state, or are we talking about the screen, some kind of UI testing like screenshot testing or
UI.
something?
Yeah, so one of the good things about the Buffer Android app is most of the business logic we have like a good chunk of tests for. But that's also the bad thing, that certain screens which are written in legacy ways like MVP, or like fully XML based, they have been really hard to write UI tests for.
Hmm.
Like take for example this composer itself. It has pretty high test coverage in terms of unit tests, right? But it was close to zero when it came to UI tests, right? And that's not because we don't want to write tests for it. It's just that it's so hard, right?
Yeah.
There are the state is scattered in like multiple different layers. So for us to just be able to set up the testing environment, right? That all the injections work correctly, the state is set up correctly. We'll have to ensure that the test state syncs across like the compose, the presenter, and then the view models and all of the different views, right? And then trying to wrap your head around that, okay, I have to set up a screen where the state is scattered between like 6 7 different sources. What is like the starter state for that? It's like impossible. Like you can't figure out like a reliable way to do that consistently for every test case that you write. So we never bothered writing UI tests for it. Like it was so hard for us to do that. But now that we're like incrementally migrating each component into Compose, as
Hmm.
I talked about earlier, we also have to think about like leaning down our state. Like it doesn't have to consume the entire state object. That essentially means that it's much easier for us to like write tests for those components, right? Because we all the setup that it needs is like a list of fake models, and then we see if the stuff that we're looking for is present or not. So that way we have like a pretty good hierarchy of tests. We have component level tests, we have like screen level tests, and then we are also going to write like flow level tests as well. So yeah, that's been like a huge benefit also.
Got it. So this question is about your experience working with Compose, right? So Was there any surprise? For example, it may be good, it may be bad, right? So when you were going through this migration process, so did you face any surprise that, oh, I did not think about this before? It's kind of new. It may be good, it may be bad. So is there any those kind of scenarios?
Hmm. Yeah, it's, I won't say surprise, but like it almost feels like, sometimes it feels very counterintuitive.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for example, there are certain patterns where Google promotes actually passing down your entire view model to a specific component, right?
Hmm.
From a convenience standpoint, it makes sense. Like, yeah, why not? But then, like, inherently, we've done MVVM for so long, it makes like, makes you like cringe. Like, why are we doing
Hmm.
this? This should not be done, right?
Hmm.
So there have been instances like that. But like, if you talk about like, being completely like startled by something that Composer, not really. We faced issues like here and there, which used to be very straightforward with XML, right? Theming is one of them. For some reason, theming does not consistently work for us as expected, especially with like light mode and dark mode.
Hmm.
Certain things that used to be very easy, like, you have a variant in your resources for light mode colors and then for dark mode colors. The system takes care of switching it out. For some reason, I don't know if it's like a component based thing or if it's a compose thing. We've noticed that in certain cases it works fine. Certain cases it somehow just adds some elevation based, whitewash to certain colors. But I think, yeah, that's like small issues. But overall, setting up the theming has been pretty straightforward. It's not as complicated as themes and styles. It's not as complicated as with XML, but not really. Aside from these things, like, yeah, because you also have to consider the fact that, before Compose came out, both of us were playing with it. Like, before I joined Buffer, I think I was playing with it. So we've essentially been with Compose while the API was evolving. So we're pretty familiar with it. So by the time we
Hmm.
started working on the Buffer app, introducing Compose into it, at that point there was no element of surprise left for us. Like, it was like, okay, fair enough, this makes sense. But yeah, one of the things that we constantly get annoyed by, and we were also talking about this before the stream, is like there are so many things that we consider stable, but they are still flagged as experimental. And like our entire code base is littered with that right now. So
Hmm.
that's not like the best things in terms of like, being like clean about it. But yeah, apart from that, nothing else.
Okay. So, if someone wants to migrate their code base right now, so what will be the suggestions you will give to them?
First of all, like you should have like a very compelling reason for you to migrate,
Hmm.
right? Just because Compose is new and just because like it's the hot new thing, don't do it. Spend some time learning about it. I'll recommend that because of it's like the inevitable future. But like we are in a weird state right now where if you talk about it just works, Compose is not there yet. You can see that about like XML, right? It has
Hmm.
like 10 years worth of development and history behind it. So there will be issues, some issues, glitches, performance issues that you might run into. You should have like a very compelling reason for you to like migrate to Compose. Like if you think your current product is not well architected, or there are a lot of state related bugs because your view holds its own state and then your business layers hold its own state, and you think that there is a lot of value in actually consolidating it. Yes, by all means do that. But yeah, so like if you have a compelling reason, do it. And at that point, what you need to start thinking about is um, there are certain prerequisites for like ideally being able to start working on Compose, and it makes a lot of sense that you first prepare your like project for being able to adopt it. One of the biggest things that you can do for yourself is start off with the state itself. As much state as you can consolidate into one single place for your screens to be able to consume, the more straightforward it is going to be for you to be able to migrate that screen away from Compose. Because um, if if your screen setup is in a way where components hold their own business logic, there's some logic in the presenter, some logic coming from your view model, then there's no real advantage to just using Compose. At that point, it just comes down to like, oh, this is just a UI layer thing, right? But for you to be able to like drive the the most value out of it, you have to think about Compose from like the from a holistic view, right? Your state plays a very big role in how Compose renders itself, right? So if you want to ensure that you get the full benefit, you also want to make sure that your data layer, your business layer is also working with Compose to essentially facilitate that. So if you just don't want it to be a replacement for XML, then state like definition and cleanup would be like the first step. Do that, ensure there's like good testability there, and then like of course once that is done, it's pretty straightforward to like start building out components and then hooking it up to the state. Because then like if that is not the case, if your state is not built properly, then what you will find yourself doing is you're building those components out, but for the variations, you don't know where those variations will come from. Will it come from your presenter? Will it come from your view state that was previously there? And if it does that mean that your composable now holds that state, right? And essentially this essentially means like in the earlier days of Kotlin, we were essentially writing Java in Kotlin, right?
Yeah.
We didn't have like proper paradigms for doing that. So yeah, you'll start dumping your state into composables where it does not make sense to, right? So that's the thing. Like you want to avoid writing, XML in Compose. So like ensuring that state ownership is clearly defined, where it sits, it's clearly defined. That's taken care of first, and that's when you start seeing the immense value. Like you just like consume one object, and it takes care of all of the variations through it. So that's important for that.
Understood. How is the community support? For example, if you're doing if you're trying to build something in Compose and you got stuck, so what are the channels people can use to get answers?
Yeah, the Slack channel is pretty good for finding something that's trivial and you don't know about. Like if it's a common issue, you'll most likely find it there or on Stack Overflow.
You're talking about the
Sometimes if you're
Kotlin
running-
Lang Slack channel, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. If there is something really specific that is going on, Compose is like fairly new, so there's also a possibility that no one has run into that error. So in that case, there are two things. One, the Compose team itself is like pretty receptive and like active on the feedback channels. Like if you raise a bug report, you will have some traction in it like in a couple of days itself. But then also like that's where the simplicity of the framework also comes in, right? More often than not, what I have noticed is if I'm writing something custom for myself and it has some issues, just think about it from the first principles perspective and like just redo it. Like sometimes just redoing it or like thinking about it from a different angle also helps out. Because you don't have to think about a lot of the inherent things like, how does this refresh or how does layout and placement work? So you just have to essentially think about drawing a view based on an object's properties, right? So sometimes just changing your approach also works. But yeah, like I've not really run into like we worked with pretty complex things like video playback and media uploads and things like that, and we've run into issues. Not saying that, but we've not really run into an issue where we've not been able to find a solution or a workaround for it so far, luckily. So yeah, like just like the regular channels work, but like the Compose team is pretty active on the Slack. Bug reports also get a lot of traction. So use that.
Got it. How is the documentation situation as of now? And if someone wants to start with Compose, just start with Compose, where should they start?
Yeah, documentation is pretty good. I think if you are going to get started, I think DAC is like the best place to go. Just follow their they have the Compose path, right? All of the different modules, go through that. That should be more than enough. And also like the code is also very straightforward in terms of documentation. It's not like there's a property that is named a certain thing, but it does like 10 different things. Not like that. Yeah, it's like very easy to follow. Compared to Vue, you'll have like a much pleasant experience in terms of like trying to understand what is going on, or if something that you expect it to do is not present, like spinning off something of your own is also very straightforward, just because of how simple it is to work with.
Okay. Adnan, do you have any question?
Yeah. So we spoke about a little about Compose and the testing aspect of it, right? One of the challenges, as you mentioned, is state recommendation, right? Like, where does your state need to live? And I understand why there is no strong recommendation or opinion from Google at this point of time, because it depends, right? It depends on what you're trying to actually
Yes.
do, right? Uh, I think one other area that I've heard a lot of people run into issues specifically is navigation, especially if you are a multi-module project using Jetpack Compose. Because the way the navigation works is you need to have access to it, and the hack so far that we have all been using is hoist the navigation somewhere in the app layer and then do a callback into that from the module, given that app layer has access to all the modules, and then navigate across module, right? Uh, have you run into any of such issues? How has navigation been, or have you not been worried about navigation so far?
We have not been worried about navigation. So, like, let me give you some context. We are like a multi-module project, and we have like the typical business layer separation. Like we have core, data, remote, cache, and whatnot. But then we also have like feature level modules as well. So what it essentially means is some screens exclusively live inside of a modules. Some are essentially like in the root app level module. So we do have to talk through them. Um, we used to like the earlier approach that we had pre-compose when we didn't have anything related to compose within a code base was we had like fully classified address names into a module, which was I think it was called something around navigator, I think, right? So it had fully classified class names of all of the screens that we had, and essentially if you wanted to navigate from module A to module B, from one screen of module A to module B, A would essentially depend on the navigator module, and then we would just dispatch an intent based on the class name. That's like very straightforward. um, that like again not the best way, I think. So we recently also started using deep links for doing cross module navigation, or like launching to a specific screen outside of the app. Like if you, let's say we send you an email about a particular feature, and if you just click on that email you have to launch a very specific screen. We've started using deep links for that, but we not really run into like navigation based issues yet, is because most of the places so far which are heavily using compose, they are like new compose screens, right? So those compose features, they use their own like compose based navigation. So within themselves they're pretty easy to like work with, because those screens itself are written like just pure compose and their own navigation methods. But let's say if you were to navigate from like a legacy module A to this new compose based module like B, we just use the traditional method to navigate into this screen, and then let this screen handle however it has to navigate within the different aspects. Yeah.
Right, right. And related to that, right? Uh, One of the things that I think is pretty early to talk about. I think Google has just started supporting quite a bit around that front. Is in general the performance, right? Like the view hierarchy
Mm-hmm.
being composed, given that it is like a declarative UI, something like what you have today as React as a web version,
Mm-hmm.
competitive open. Uh, the problem with it is that, right? Like you really need to make sure what you're doing. You need to understand when a re-render occurs at every time, what property causes it, right? And we have
Mm-hmm.
started seeing that support for those things, right? Like I think electric eel stable and the Fleming
Mm-hmm.
canary that are out there today start showing
Yeah.
the composition counts and the view hierarchy that actually is triggering. Uh,
Yeah.
how do you feel about that? I know it might be too early for you all to look at the performance at this part of the journey, but do you have plans around how you want to look at that? How do you compare two screens existing versus what you eventually end up with? How do you think of those?
Yeah. Good question. The short answer is actually we're not looking at it from a performance perspective yet, because we like there of course there are like noticeable performance differences, right? When you compare a compose based screen versus a view based screen, because it has 10 years worth of like iterations behind it. But the reason why we are not looking at it right now is because the tooling itself, it'll take a while to get mature. Like even if you think about Kotlin versus Java right now, hands down Java has more performance, right? But it's not fun to work with. But the good thing there about Compose is it takes away a lot of things that you used to be worried about, or it was your job to worry about in the past, right? Like for now, yes, you need to understand how recompositions work, but do you need to account for it? No, not really, right? But then there are like certain things that are outright, like if there are like unnecessary recompositions happening, right? Having an understanding of why recompositions are happening is like, of course, good. But then with the current tooling itself that's available right now, it's also not that difficult to actually determine what might be causing it, right?
Okay.
So isolating those bugs is has not been as tricky as it used to be with XML. Like with XML, you'll have to essentially like do a heap dump and figure out what the hell is going on that's causing like a slowdown of your main thread, right? It's not as complicated as that. And also like 9 out of 10 times you don't have to worry about like why are redraws happening, right? That's for the framework to take care of, right?
Mhm.
As long as you have your state modeled correctly and you're taking care of your own business level variations, that should be more than enough, right? If there are, of course, like if you're expecting a variation and you're not getting it, more likely that's like a business logic problem, right? You're not like not handling that in your view model or in your business logic property. That's the reason why it's showing up incorrectly, right? But saying that like there are performance issues in rendering or performance issues in scrolling, more often than not you don't have to worry about it. And if there is an issue that's coming from your code, it's not that hard to actually debug with the current set of tools. But yes, having said all of that, yes, it still has a long way to go in terms of being at par with views. But then again, like it's just been out for like what, a year and a half or two, right? So yeah, it's very early days.
Right, right. Fair enough. Uh, if you had to pick one thing that you think you really like about it compared to XML, can be a personal preference, but then what would that be? What do you think is the most motivating factor for you to like prefer Compose over XML at this point of time?
Component based test, like hands down. Like it's like you can still write UI tests with Espresso on Android,
Mhm.
but that will always be screen based, right?
Right, right.
Okay.
You'll have to like jump through hoops to get it to work for like individual components, or you'll have to adopt like third party frameworks for screenshot testing.
Mhm.
The fact that it is like comes out of the box with Compose, like game changer, because you can isolate that one component, give it a state object to play with, and just test all of the variations. That will improve like the reliability of apps like a huge margin. So yeah, but for me, like that's like the biggest uh, benefit.
Right, almost to the point wherein today it is, I'd not say as fast as unit tests, but then at least in terms of a logic, the way you think about UI tests at least change. That mindset changes that hey, you could just test that one component in isolation, which used to be very hard to do if you wrote like a traditional espresso test, right? Because then you would mock all the state and create that variation for that one component, test it, and then keep doing this for all the components. And this can like get out of hand very soon, very quickly if your screen has a lot of components to deal with.
Yeah, and like also if you think about it from just like a product perspective, most engineers who are building Android apps professionally today will like have like a decent machine to work with, right? A Mac most likely, and like if
Yeah,
you're building Android apps in 2022, your company is, I'm like taking it like as a liberty that they might have given you like an M1 Mac, right? I think at that point a small downside in speed or small like drop off in speed is like an acceptable loss for me if in return I'm getting the ability to write so many tests for like components
okay.
at such a fast pace, right? There's zero setup involved. You can think about all of the edge cases and spin it out really fast. Fine, it takes a little while to run compared to unit tests, but from a product reliability perspective, if it goes down to your end users, if it has less bugs,
Mhm.
I'm all for it, right? It shouldn't matter if like unit tests run faster. Of course, like yes, that'll always be the preferred way to test your business logic. But on Android, we've never really had a way to reliably test UI so far. Like that comes from Google, right? So that's like a huge advantage.
Right. And just to add to that point, right, I think uh, even if it takes a slightly higher amount of time, I think it is the price that you're going to be paying is almost always on the CI/CD server and not on your local workflow, right?
Yeah.
90% of the
Always
times
worth it.
you will never want to run it locally, and that I think that is like your build being delayed by 10-15 minutes. I don't think is a deal breaker. In return for the amount of, as you rightly said, right, the confidence that it gives you that hey, all my UI works as expected, and you
Yeah.
can like at least in isolation you know that they work independently perfectly fine. All the variations, as you said, especially today, right? I think one of the struggles why we don't see a lot of UI tests written across the industry in Android is generally because one has the instrumentation and all the framework and setup that is required. The second part of it, I think, boils down to also the fact that it makes it harder to test, right? Like you have to actually go through a lot of logic just to test it, modify it. Tomorrow, if you have to uh, change something, right, and then that becomes like a huge task, and nobody wants to do that, right? Because a unit test is easy in isolation, you can test it, and that's what was not possible so far, right? And I think that has been very evident with a lot of third-party libraries showing up as well, right? Like people, I have seen people using Paparazzi and Showcase in combination to do screenshot testing of Compose because the way they lets you hook
Hmm.
it without being you bogged down by the view system that we are used to, right?
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. Yeah.
Cool. Anything else, Beda?
I have one last question. So, have you
Yes.
seen any difference in productivity from the developer point of view in working with Compose versus working with traditional XML or view-based, Java view-based UI?
Yes, and you will not like the answer. Um, so with our composer, it's mostly written in views, and like we are actively migrating it, but it's not fully migrated yet, or not even like I won't say it's like even scratched the surface. It's going to be
Okay.
like a multi-quarter effort for us to get there. Every single time we have to either I or Joe has to work on the composer. Following that release, we have to take time off. Like
Mm-hmm.
not even kidding. I've
Mm-hmm.
noticed this. But what I have noticed is every time we work with Compose, and this is like no one asks us to do that,
Yeah.
we stay beyond our hours and work on it because it's
Mm-hmm.
just so much fun to work with it. So yeah, from a productivity standpoint, it's very good. It's a lot of fun to work with because takes care of a lot of different things for you that you just hack around and like build whatever you want with it. Uh, it does not irritate you. That's the fun
Mm-hmm.
part, right? Like it's just like yeah. So it like from time off perspective, it's good for your company. Engineers will not be taking like as many leaves as they take with Compose. So like that's like sort of like kidding, but yeah, that is the case. When we have to go back to our legacy layers and work with it, it's like we are tearing our hair out. Like why was this way? Like, it seems obvious right now that it needs to be better. But
Mm-hmm.
now that we think about it, I think in those past refactor attempts, the strategy was slightly more aggressive and more ambitious, and that's why they failed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the reason why we're taking a conservative approach right now. We're not going to commit to a timeline. We're not going to say that entire screen rewrite and compose. No,
Mm-hmm.
we are going to build it piece by piece. We'll replace things as it like as we've refactored them. Um, but yeah, like making those big promises is essentially like setting yourself up for failure. But so far it's been like a lot of fun to work with Compose, and to an extent that we are no longer writing any new features, however mission critical it may be
Mm-hmm.
in XML.
Mm-hmm.
We always go down to Compose, and like we also look for opportunities every time we have to come back to a legacy screen. Um, do we have time on our hand to actually migrate it over to Compose? And sometimes we don't. But then what we end up doing is fine. We don't have time to actually do this entire thing in Compose, like or rather refactor this entire thing in Compose. We go at least 50% of the way and like clean up the state so that whenever we have the time, we can come back and do a quick swap of the UI, and set up for success later on. So that's how we've tackled the breakdown of this entire task. Like every single ticket within our Jira for the refactor is like threefold. One, first of all, like state cleaning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because literally the biggest piece of work in this refactor is essentially consolidating all of the state and moving it into one reliable place so that eventually Compose can consume it.
Right.
And then, yeah, you write the component in Compose, swap it out, and then you test it, right? But the biggest and most important part for us has to be like state consolidation. Yeah.
Cool. Cool. I think this has been a lot of fun. Thanks, Pratik, for joining the stream. Adan, do you have any last question or?
No, I think I just want to take the opportunity to thank Pratik again. I think this was
Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
very insightful, especially for somebody who is going through, because I think most of the people out there today won't have the luxury to rewrite from scratch for
Right.
sure. Like that is like a massive undertaking for a company to be going through, right? So
Hmm.
like I am assuming 80% of the people out there are always going to have to move slowly, refactor, and these are challenges that are going to exist, right? Like as you said, MVP, MVVM, there's going to be a legacy architecture. If you have used data binding, then that's something you'll need to deal with separately, right? So this was very insightful and helpful to get a sense of what to run into, what to expect. I think knowing that gives a lot of clarity as to hey, how do we want to approach it. Let's try to tackle what first. And as you said, rightly said, that if you even if you are not in a state today to move to composed directly, start looking at your state and modeling it in a way wherein it can be used and make your life easier in the long term, right? Yeah. Thanks again for taking time to speaking to us.
Yes.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Cool. Then I'm ending the stream now. Thank you. Thanks, all of
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
you.